for her hand. He reached for her broken suitcase, the one lying in the dirt, and lifted it like it was something worth saving. Wallace had just told Clara Whitmore, if he sold in Red Hollow, Montana, he didn't want her anymore, saying that she could turn around and go back to wherever she came from. Clara stood there dressed gray, with dust, eyes dry because she had already used up every tear she had left on the train, and she did not move. Subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. Comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Platform at Red Hollow smelled like coal smoke and dried mud, and Clara Whitmore stepped off that iron step with her chin lifted because that was the only thing she still owned outright. Her posture was negotiable. The suitcase in her right hand had a broken latch, held together with a leather strap she had borrowed from a kind porter 2 stops back. Her left hand pressed her mother's letter against her ribs, folded inside her coat pocket, as if the paper itself could hold her upright. She read that letter 47 times since leaving Philadelphia, word by memory, but she kept it close anyway, but some things aren't about information. Some things are about weight, about feeling the realness of something when the world around you turns strange. Hollow was very strange. It wasn't a big town. Nothing out here was big. There were maybe 60 people gathered on and around that platform, which told her that a mail-order bride arriving on the noon train was apparently the most interesting thing to happen in Red Hollow since the last time something interesting happened. Men in worn boots, women in calico, children pressed between adult legs, peering at her like she was a traveling exhibit. She had expected Edwin Wallace. She had a picture of him. Jaw, wide mustache, the kind of face that looked permanently sun-squinted. Her 11 letters over 6 months. Letters, each one careful and deliberate, each one signed yours in hope, Edwin, written back 9 times. Her 9th letter had included the measurements for her wedding dress because he had asked, and because the seamstress required them 2 weeks in advance. She scanned the platform. She found him almost immediately because he was the only man standing alone at the center of the crowd, not watching her with curiosity, but watching her with something else entirely. She knew that look. She had seen it on her father's face. The morning the bank men came to collect the debts, had seen it on her brother's face. The night he told her he could not take her in, he could not. On specific expression. It doesn't look like fear, exactly. Words and months. It looks like a man who has already decided something terrible and is simply waiting for the moment he has to say it out loud. Wallace was waiting for that moment. Clara walked toward him anyway. Because what else do? You traveled 1,000 miles. When you are standing on a platform in Montana, you walked toward the man, stopped 3 feet in front of him. Mr. Wallace, she said. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that. He pulled off his hat at his side, looked at her the way a man looks at a figure in a ledger that doesn't add up. Miss Whitmore, I'm glad the journey is over, she said. I was told you would arrange for a wagon. I need to say something. The crowd had gone very quiet. She noticed that. The way sound drains out of a place when people sense that something is about to happen that they will be talking about for a long time. She waited, and Wallace. Psalms had written her 11 letters and signed each one. Yours in hope, Person said. Looked at her and said, changed my mind. I don't need a wife anymore. The silence lasted 2 full seconds. In those 2 seconds, Clara's mind did something strange. Very calm and very clear. The way a lake goes still just before a stone hits the surface, in that impossible fraction of a moment before the ripples begin. She thought, I still have $17, she thought. The next eastbound train doesn't leave until Thursday. She thought, Mother, I'm sorry. Then the ripples came. Somewhere behind her laughed not a full laugh, more a half-swallowed sound that she tried to pull back and couldn't. Muttered something. Another man responded. Children were shushed. And Clara became aware, with the kind of total and complete awareness that only humiliation produces. A single person on that platform was watching her receive the worst moment of her life as if it were a performance put on for their benefit. She did not cry. She would not give Red Hollow her tears. When she did still, she had decided that somewhere in the 2 seconds of silence, without quite knowing she was deciding it, he looked at Edwin Wallace very steadily and said, "I see." Anyway, he said. He didn't sound sorry. He didn't sound sorry. He sounded relieved, the way people sound when they've been dreading a conversation and they finally had it and it's going the way they hoped. She said. Something flickered across his face. Guilt. Exactly. Discomfort. The difference between a man who feels bad about what he did and a man who feels bad that he has to look at it. It's just circumstances have changed, Edwin said. He's talking to her chin now, instead of her eyes. You got enough trouble with the ranch without adding. Without adding what, Mr. Wallace? He stopped. Go ahead, Clara said quietly. I already said the important part in front of 60 people. Finish it. His jaw tightened. The crowd had gotten so quiet she could hear the horses shifting their weight against the hitching post down the street. Just don't need a wife, he said again. I'm sorry you made the trip. Not sorry I made the trip, Clara said. You are sorry you are standing here right now. Different things. A murmur moved through the crowd like a wave. His face went red. Now listen here. No, Clara said, and her own voice surprised her with its steadiness. I think I will listen. I've listened to 11 letters, mister. I've listened to every promise you made on paper. I think I've done quite enough listening. She picked up her suitcase. Broken latch gave. The lid swung open. Contents: 3 dresses, her mother's Bible, a small tin of buttons, the ribbon her sister had pressed into her hand. At the station in Philadelphia, everything spilled across the platform, planks in a cascade of quiet domesticity. The crowd stared at her underthings, at her Bible, at the blue ribbon lying in the dirt, and then someone laughed. They laughed this time. Loud and mean, the kind of laugh that invites other laughs to follow it. Clara crouched down. She began collecting her things. Her hands were steady. She folded the dresses. She retrieved the Bible. She picked up every last button from between the planks. It helped her. Edwin Wallace did not move. The crowd watched. It was almost done when she heard footsteps, not the shuffling kind, not the hesitant kind, but the deliberate kind that belonged to a man who has decided something and is moving toward it without ambivalence. Heels on platform boards, steady and unhurried as a heartbeat. She looked up. The man crouching beside her was not what she expected. Tall, she could tell, that even crouching, with the kind of weathered quality that doesn't come from age so much as from being outside every day for many years. His hands, he reached for her mother's Bible and handed it to her without a word. It went large and scarred along the knuckles. The hands of a man who worked with them constantly. He picked up her suitcase. He looked at the broken latch with the same focused attention a man might give to a fence that needed mending, not troubled by it, just assessing it. Then he looked around the platform until he found something, and he crossed to a post where a coil of thin rope hung on a nail. He took a length of it, came back, and lashed the suitcase shut with 3 precise knots. He set it upright beside her. Then he straightened to his full height to face the crowd, in a voice that was not loud but carried anyway. A woman who traveled this far deserves more than humiliation. The laughter stopped. It stopped so completely and so suddenly that the silence felt physical, like something you could press your hand against. Clara stood. She looked at this man who had not introduced himself, who had not asked her permission before helping her, but who had also somehow managed to help her in the only way that mattered, not by saving her things, but by making the crowd understand that her things were worth saving. He wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. He was looking at Edwin Wallace. You gave your word to her, he said. You put it in writing and you sent it across the country. A man's word is the only thing he truly owns. You sold yours cheap. Wallace's face was no longer red. It had gone a different color, the gray-white of a man whose authority over a situation has just been removed from him without his consent, Edwin said. His voice had a warning in it. The man replied, and that was all. Just a name. The way he said it made Edwin take 1 half step backward, which every person on that platform noticed. and which every person on that platform would still be talking about 3 days later. Wyatt Callahan turned back to Clara. He looked at her, not at her dusty dress, not at the ribbons coming loose from her hair, not at the suitcase with its rope repair job, but at her the way very few people had looked at her in recent memory. Like she was a person whose interior life was as complicated and valuable as his own. He said, "I'm Wyatt Callahan. I have a ranch about 2 miles north of town. My housekeeper retired in the spring, and I've been making do. You need a place to rest and work while you figure out your next steps. The offer is there. Your own room, no conditions." Clara stared at him. "Conditions?" she repeated. "None," he said. "I'm not Edwin Wallace." And somehow, in Red Hollow, Montana, then, on the worst afternoon of her life, Whitmore almost smiled. He didn't say yes immediately. That surprised him. It surprised him because something shifted in his expression, not disappointment, but recalibration, the slight adjustment of a man who expected a specific response and got a different one. Appreciated that. She appreciated that he didn't press. "I need a moment," she said. "Take your time," Wyatt said. He stepped back a few feet, giving her space, and turned his attention to a point somewhere past the station roof, which was both polite and practical. It gave her room to think without making her feel observed. She thought she had $17, a return train ticket she had purchased against her better judgment before leaving Philadelphia. Because she expected to use it, but because her father had always said never without knowing how you'll get home. The ticket was still good. She could use it. She could be back in Philadelphia by Saturday. Then what? Her brother's house, where she was not precisely welcome. Friend Margaret's boarding room, where there was no space. Own savings, which would last maybe 6 weeks, if she was careful. She had nothing to go back to. She had come west because there was nothing behind her. Come west because Edwin Wallace's letters had described a life that seemed possible, a life where she could be useful and respected and real. She had believed them, and she had been wrong. And now she was standing on a platform on Montana with a rope-lashed suitcase and 60 strangers memorizing her face. She looked at Wyatt Callahan. He was still looking at the roof. Guy, some distant thing that wasn't her, which she found oddly respectful. She said, "Fair wages," she said. He looked back at her. $3 a month. Same as I paid Mrs. Halloran. It was a real wage. That was more than she'd made sewing in Philadelphia. "And my own room," she said. "With a lock," he said. "Key." She studied his face for the thing she was looking for. The calculation, the angle, the hidden expectation that all of this generosity would need to be paid back in ways that hadn't been spoken aloud yet. He'd learned to look for that. She had spent the last 5 years of her life learning to look for it in men's faces. She didn't find it in his. What she found instead was something harder to name. Tired and careful and genuine. The face of a man who was offering something because it was the right thing to do, and not because he expected to profit from it. 3 months, she said. "I'll work for 3 months. It doesn't suit either of us. I leave with my wages and no hard feelings." 3 months, he agreed. "And I manage the household," she said. "I don't take orders about how to run a kitchen." It happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "Wouldn't dream of it," he said. Clara picked up her suitcase, the one with the rope latch, and nodded once. "Let's go," she said. She walked past Edwin Wallace without looking at him. Say her name, Miss Whitmore, behind her, but she kept walking, and Wyatt Callahan fell into step beside her, and the crowd parted. Hollow watched the stranger bride walk away from the worst moment of her life like she was walking towards something better. She didn't know yet whether she was, but she walked like she believed it. Still, and sometimes she had learned that was the only thing that got you through. The ride to the Callahan Ranch took 22 minutes. She knew this because she counted, not obsessively, just steadily. The way she had learned to measure things when she was nervous, not the time itself, but the texture of it. Minute felt different from 2 minutes. 22 minutes was long enough to make a decision about a person. Wyatt Callahan drove the way he did everything. Listen, it seemed, without wasted motion, without unnecessary sound. Phil's silence was small talk. He didn't ask her questions she wasn't ready to answer. He watched the road and managed the horse and let her exist beside him, without performing anything for his benefit. He was aware that she was evaluating him. She was also aware that this was entirely fair. For about 10 minutes, she said, "Why did you do that?" He didn't pretend not to know what she meant, because it needed doing. It's not an answer. He was quiet for a moment. A big, steady bay kept its pace without prompting. Your mother came west on a promise, he said finally. Lord or bride. Man who invited her had a change of heart about 20 minutes after she stepped off the wagon. Her at the general store with 25 cents and the name of a boarding house. Absorbed this. What happened to her? She managed, Wyatt said. She was that kind of woman. But she shouldn't have had to manage alone. He paused. 8. Too small to do anything about it. So today you weren't 8 anymore, Clara said. He glanced at her sideways. Something like that. Got his hands on the reins. Scarred, strong. The hands of a man who had been working hard since he was old enough to work. He did her proud. Clara said quietly. He didn't respond to that, son. But something in the set of his shoulders shifted just slightly, as if he had put something down. Ranch is basic, he said. Back to practical matters. You're not going to oversell it. The house has been quiet a while. Mrs. Halloran kept it running. But she's been in Billings with her daughter since April. Things have been let go. I noticed you said basic and not a disaster, Clara said. Which means it's a disaster. Another almost smile. The kitchen needs work. How much work? The word condemned might be too strong, but not inaccurate. Mrs. Halloran had a different relationship with cleaning than I might prefer. Pressed her lips together to keep from laughing. I want to be transparent, she said. You just offered me honest work in a room with a lock after I was publicly humiliated by a man I traveled 1,000 miles to marry. Credibility with me is quite high. He nodded as if filing this away. To know. They rode in companionable silence after that. The kind of silence that doesn't need filling because the people inside it have both decided, without saying so, that they're going to be decent to each other and can therefore relax. Sheila watched Montana go past the wide sky, the impossible distances, and felt beneath the exhaustion and humiliation and grief she hadn't expected to feel for a very long time. She was curious about what came next. That wasn't nothing. In the last year of her life, curiosity had been in very short supply. She'd been too busy surviving to wonder about anything. Now, on a wagon beside a man she didn't know, heading toward a ranch she'd never seen, she found herself wanting to know things. What did the ranch look like from the hill before you came? Down to it? What did the kitchen smell like? Even ruined. What was Wyatt Callahan like at dinner when the workday was over? She pressed the questions down. Premature, all of them. She was getting ahead of herself. 3 months, fair wages, and with a lock. That was what she had agreed to. All this was. But curiosity, she had learned, was a form of hope. And hope, even small and cautious and badly battered, was alive in her. The person she met at the Callahan Ranch was a cowhand named Deke. Deke was approximately 60 years old, shaped like a barrel that someone had balanced a hat on, and he looked at Clara with the open suspicion of a man who had learned to be careful about new things. He was also, she would later discover, the most important opinion on that ranch outside of Wyatt Callahan's own. Deke had worked for Wyatt's father before Wyatt had watched Wyatt grow up from a serious, quiet boy into a serious, quiet man, and had appointed himself, without anyone asking him to, the general guardian of the Callahan Ranch's best interest, which he interpreted broadly and enforced with the kind of confident stubbornness that can only be achieved after 60 years of being right most of the time. At Clara, the way a man looks at weather he isn't sure about. The woman, from the train, he asked Wyatt. This is Miss Whitmore, Wyatt said. She'll be managing the household. Deke's eyes mommed over Clara with the economy of a man who has learned to assess things quickly, looking for the thing that would tell him. Whether she would last 3 weeks or 3 months, whether she was fragile or durable, she was the kind of woman who would require a great deal of handling or could be left alone to find her own way. Looked back at him with equal economy. She had been looked at by harder men than this, had been dismissed by people with more power than a ranch foreman. She simply stood and let him look, because that was the most efficient way to pass this particular test. Kitchen, Deke said finally. What about it? Clara asked. Seen it yet? No. Might want to prepare yourself. Deke considered. You know how sometimes a place gets so far gone that giving up seems like the kindest option? Mr. Deke, Clara said. I rearranged my entire life this morning with 15 minutes notice. The kitchen and I will come to an understanding. Deke blinked. Wyatt. He looked at Wyatt. Wyatt's expression was entirely neutral, in the way of a man who is carefully not showing something. Looked back at Clara. Something in his face shifted, just slightly, the almost imperceptible softening of a test that has been passed. 6, he said, and walked away. Wyatt led Clara inside, kitchen, which was, in fact, bad. Quite bad, one. Though not condemnable in the structural sense, her room, the main hall, the pump, the root cellar, the storage situation, which was complicated, thorough and efficient, and didn't apologize for the state of things, while also acknowledging, with practical honesty, that several things needed significant attention. Listened. Gansson asked 3 questions. 1. Took a mental inventory of what she had to work with. 1. And estimated how long it would take to make the place functional. 3 days for the kitchen. 2 weeks for the rest of the first floor. She could do it. She had done harder things. When Wyatt finished the tour, he stopped in the hallway and looked at her with a directness she was already beginning to associate with him, not rude. He went, just unfiltered, the gaze of a man who had decided sole performances were too expensive. Do you need anything else today? He asked. Clara thought about everything that had happened since 9 o'clock that morning. Station platform. Edwin's face, her things in the dirt. People watching. A hot cup of coffee would not go amiss, she said. Wyatt Callahan went and made her coffee. It was the best coffee she'd had since Philadelphia. And she drank it in the kitchen that needed work. She looked around at the broken and the dusty and the forgotten one, and she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Happy, not settled, not safe, just present, alive to the moment, with no distance between herself and what was actually happening. Here. This was real. The coffee was hot, and the room needed attention, and the man who had made the coffee was somewhere outside now, doing whatever ranchers did in the hour before supper. And she had $17 in her pocket, and a room with a lock, and 3 months to figure out what came next. Where in Philadelphia, Edwin Wallace had been a possibility. In Montana, Edwin Wallace was a closed door. Clara put down the coffee cup, stood up, and began taking stock of what needed to be done. First night, she could not sleep. Not unusual. Not concerning. Just the stubborn wakefulness of a body that is in a new place and not yet convinced it is safe. 1. She lay in the dark in the room. With the lock, she had checked the lock twice before getting into bed. Quietly, so no one would hear. And she looked at the ceiling and listened to the ranch at night. It was different from anything she had known. Philadelphia had been full of night sound, carriages, voices, the distant smells, the general ongoing noise of a city that never fully quieted. This was the opposite of that. This was a silence so large it had texture. She could hear wind across the grass. She could hear very faintly the sounds of animals settling. She could hear her own breathing. She thought about Edwin Wallace's face. She thought, I should have been angrier. And then I was angry. Just didn't show it. And then, why didn't I show it? She knew the answer to that. She had grown up in a world that told women their anger was inappropriate, excessive, unbecoming. She had spent so many years carefully moderating herself, her tone, her expression, her responses, that the anger had somewhere along the way learned to convert itself into something quieter before it reached the surface. She called it composure. But lying here in the dark room, with a lock, one, in a house that was not hers, one, in a life that had just been revised without her consent. She let herself feel it, the fury of it, the absolute indignity of standing on that platform and being told she was unnecessary, the humiliation of her things in the dirt. Again, the sound of that laugh from the crowd. She hadn't been able to identify whose laugh it was, but she had absorbed it completely, when the way bodies absorb cold, to the bone, down to the... She was angry when she let herself be angry, fully and completely, in the privacy of a locked room, until the anger burned down to something smaller and steadier and more useful. Then she thought about Wyatt Callahan. She thought he didn't have to do that. He genuinely hadn't had to do it. He had no obligation to her. He didn't know her. She could have been anyone helpless, he called, then, dishonest, and any number of things. He hadn't known. He had simply assessed a situation where someone was being treated without dignity and intervened as if that were the obvious and necessary thing to do. It was the most uncomplicated kindness she had received in a very long time. He thought about what he'd said on the wagon, his mother, general store, the 25 cents. I was 8, small to do anything about it. When she thought about a boy of 8 watching his mother manage alone, filing that away somewhere deep, reciting something, without knowing he was reciting it, and then being 20, whatever he was today, and seeing a woman standing in the dirt with her things and simply deciding. Character, not performance, not strategy, and just a slow accrual of a person's choices over time, becoming visible in a single moment. She made a note of it, not romantically. She was not, she told herself firmly, being romantic about any of this. It was being a woman alone in a new place, assessing the people around her with the care that survival required. Wyatt Callahan was a person of character. That was a fact she would file away. Along with the fair wages and the room, with the lock and the coffee he had made without being asked, and the way he'd given her space on the platform to make her own decision without rushing her toward his preferred answer. She filed these things once. Then she made herself stop thinking about him, because that way, lay complications she did not need, and closed her eyes and let Montana's enormous silence do its work. She slept. Morning came gray and cold, and Clara was up before it fully arrived. She had always been a morning person, not cheerfully. She was not a cheerful morning person, the kind who hummed and stretched and greeted the sun with enthusiasm. She was a practical morning person, the kind who got up because the morning was there and work was waiting and there was no profit in lying in bed. She built a fire in the kitchen stove. It took 4 attempts because the flue needed cleaning. She noted that for the list, but on the 4th attempt, it caught properly and she felt the warmth begin to spread. She found eggs. She found a decent half loaf of bread. She found coffee, which told her that Wyatt Callahan had priorities she respected. She made breakfast for herself, and then, because it seemed natural, because the food was there, and the fire was already going, and it wasn't any harder to make food for multiple people than for one, she kept going. When Deke came through the kitchen door at 5:45, it went, hat in hand, the silent preliminary negotiation that men do when they're not sure if they're welcome somewhere, and he found the table set and the coffee ready and eggs in the pan. Stopped. He looked at the table. He looked at the eggs. He looked at Clara. Sit down, she said, in a tone that invited no discussion. He sat. Wyatt came in 10 minutes later, and he also stopped in the doorway, and he also looked at the table, and he also looked at Clara. He did it all in a single smooth sequence without the prolonged assessment that Deke had needed. You didn't have to do this, he said. I know, she said. Sit. He sat. There was a long silence while all 3 of them addressed their breakfast. The fire crackled. Someone outside another hand moved past the window and went still. The eggs were good, and the bread was toasted against the stove edge the way her mother had taught her, and the coffee was strong enough to count for something. Cleaned the flue, Wyatt said, eventually. Started to, Clara said. I'll finish it after breakfast. The chimney's drawing better, but not right yet. He at her across the table with that unfiltered directness. You've done this before. Run a household? Since I was 14. She cut her toast. Her mother was sick for 3 years. Someone had to. Deke looked up from his plate. Something had shifted in his expression, not pity. Something more careful than pity. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man placing a person in a category he respects. In the East, Deke asked. It was the first personal question he directed at her. Philadelphia, she said. Long way, he said. Yes, she said. It was all. But it was enough. She could feel something in the room settling, like water finding its level. And said, I'll need to go into town today. Talk to Will Granger about the fencing on the north side. There's been trouble with it. What kind of trouble? She asked. He glanced at her, slightly surprised by the directness of the question. Cattle got through twice last week. Don't know if it's the fence or if someone's cutting it. You know Granger well? She asked. Since we were boys. You trust him? I do. He studied her. Why? Set down her coffee cup. Because twice in 1 week isn't bad luck, she said. Luck happens once. Twice is pattern. She paused, speaking out of turn. I don't know this cunt. Wyatt said slowly. You're not speaking out of turn. Deke had gone very still. He was looking at his plate, but in the particular way that people look at things when they are actually listening very carefully. Probably nothing, Clara said. I'm sorry, I don't know enough to apologize for thinking, Wyatt said. The words landed with a quietness that made them feel larger than they were. He said it as if he meant it without caveat, without the small qualifications that men usually attached to compliments aimed at women. Apologize for thinking. Clara looked at him for a moment. She said, I won't. 3 days passed. Kitchen became functional, then clean, then gradually something close to warm. Worked methodically, the way her mother had taught her, not frantically, repressively, and unabasted, but consistently, it's those boss, attention, with the steady application of attention that was the only reliable way to make progress on anything. Repaired the flue. She scrubbed the walls. She reorganized the storage so that things were where they should be and could be found without excavation. Did not try to win the cowhands over. She simply did her work and let them adjust. Determined. Most of them did. There's a young hand named Charlie who brought her firewood without being asked, and another named Pete who started leaving the back door open in the morning so the kitchen had light earlier. Small adjustments that said more than words. There's one man, she didn't know his name yet, a quiet type who worked the east pasture who watched her with a look she recognized but couldn't quite place. Not hostile, exactly, just calculating. The way a man looks at something when he's trying to figure out how it affects him. Sauce. And moved on. On the fourth evening, once she was in the kitchen. After supper, when Wyatt knocked on the doorframe, he knocked. Listen, she noticed. It always knocked. Even though it was his own house, and said, "Moment, do you have a moment?" He sat at the kitchen table. He had been to town twice this week, and both times he had come back with the specific quality of a man who is carrying something he hasn't decided how to put down. I want to tell you something, he said. All right. Quiet for a moment, rearranging his thoughts. The fence situation is worse than I said. The other morning, he said, more cuts this week, different locations. It's not accidental. Someone is moving through my land deliberately, and I have a reasonable idea of who's behind it, she said. He looked at her, the steady, assessing look. You've been here 4 days. You told me not to apologize for thinking, she said. I'm going to hold you to that. Something shifted in his face. He might have smiled. It was hard to tell. With him, he kept his expressions close, like a man who learned early that showing things was expensive. There's a group of businessmen out of Helena, he said. We've been buying land along the valley for 2 years, consolidating it. Anyone who won't sell, they find ways to pressure. He paused. You've been after my land for 18 months. And you've been refusing. My father built this ranch. My mother kept it through 3 hard winters after he died. So it's not for sale. But they don't intend to take no for an answer, Clara said. Do. She looked at him. What do you need? He seemed surprised by the directness of it. I'm not asking you to. You're not asking, she said. I'm offering. You need. He was quiet for a long moment. I need to understand their angles, he said finally. Cattle and land and weather, I know how to work. Always know how men like this operate the legal side of things. One, the paper side, my father's records. It's in the contracts and the filing. He stopped. And fight and work. But fighting men who use paper is different from fighting men who use fists. Read contracts, Clara said. My father was a merchant. He taught me to read agreements before I was as 10. Said it was the most important thing he could give me. That's right. Wyatt said he was. She paused. Bring me what you have. It's her tonight. I'll start tonight. Wyatt looked at her the way you look at something unexpected that turns out to be exactly what you needed. Whitmore, he said. Clara, she said. If we're going to work together against land-stealing businessmen, you should probably call me Clara. Silence stretched just a beat. Clara, he said. And the way he said her name, quietly, carefully, like he was putting it somewhere so it's told her that the next 3 months were going to be considerably more complicated than she had planned. Reached out her hand for the documents. He placed them in it, and the story of Red Hollow changed direction. The documents Wyatt placed in Clara's hands that night were not organized. The first thing she noticed, not filed, not sorted, not in any order that suggested someone had ever expected another person to read them. The papers of a man who kept things because he knew they mattered, but had never had anyone to help him understand exactly how. Receipts folded into contracts. Letters tucked inside property surveys. Dates written in pencil on the backs of envelopes faded to near illegibility. Them across the kitchen table and began. When Wyatt sat across from her, he hadn't asked her if she wanted company, and she hadn't told him to leave, which was its own kind of agreement. On the leather harness that had needed mending for 2 weeks. His hands moving steadily, the lamp between them throwing warm light across everything. A long time, neither of them spoke. This deed, Clara said finally, without looking up, the one for the north pasture. The filing date and the survey date don't match. Wyatt looked up from the harness. What do you mean? The survey was done in April of 1879. But the deed was filed in June of 1880, 13 months apart. She set it down and looked at him. Was there a dispute during that time? He was quiet for a moment. Father had trouble with a man named Holt that year. The creek access on the north side. It went to the county, and my father won, but it took almost a year. He won. Did anything change about how the land was recorded? I was 15. Do you have the original survey map? He stood, went to the back room, and came back 3 minutes later with a rolled canvas that had been sitting under what appeared to be a broken saddle for an indeterminate number of years. He did it to her, and she unrolled it carefully and compared it to the deed and sat very still for a moment. Wyatt, she said. He heard something in her voice. He came around the table and looked over her shoulder at the 2 documents side by side. Boundary, she said, pointing. On the original survey, it runs along this line here. On the filed deed, the one that's in the county record, this boundary has moved, roughly 12 feet south. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. One altered the deed before filing, she said quietly. It's not possible, he said. My father would have had father was a cattleman, Clara said, not a surveyor, lawyer. He won his case, and he trusted that the paperwork would reflect that. And then he moved on to the next problem, because that's what men like your father do. She paused. He would have had no reason to compare the 2 documents side by side. Wyatt straightened. He said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was very controlled, in the way that only happens when something beneath the control is not controlled at all. How much land does 12 feet represent along that creek line? Clara said, to give someone with a good lawyer a plausible claim to the creek access itself. They own the creek access. They control the water, she said. Without the water, the north pasture isn't viable. Wyatt walked to the window. His back was to her, and she watched his shoulders and understood that she was looking at a man rearranging everything he thought he knew about a threat he had already considered serious. It was what they've been waiting for, he said. Yes, Clara said. Whoever altered that deed knew exactly what they were doing. It wasn't a careless error. This was a plan. He turned around. Light. His face was all hard lines and shadow, and Clara thought, he has been fighting this alone for too long. He's been carrying this the way men carry things when they believe they are the only ones strong enough to hold it. Who else knows about the creek boundary? She asked. He said, and Tom Harding, who does the county recording. He paused. And whoever at the county office filed this deed 14 months after the survey. You need to find out who that was, Clara said. It was 18 years ago. Remember things that were wrong, she said. Things stick in memory. If someone was paid to alter that deed before filing it, they remember. People carry guilt whether they want to or not. She began carefully refolding the documents in the order she wanted to return to them. Let me write down exactly what I found. Everything, with the dates and the measurements. Then you take it to your lawyer in the morning. I don't have a lawyer, Wyatt said. She looked up at him. Never needed one, he said. It wasn't defensive. It was just a fact, stated the way a man states facts about his life when his life has been a certain kind of simple. You need one now, she said. Someone in Billings. Not Helena. Not anyone connected to this valley. She held his gaze. You afford it? I can afford what I need to afford, he said. She picked up her pen, then let me write. He sat back down, across from her, picked up the harness again. The lamp burned between them and outside. Montana was enormous and dark. And inside, Whitmore worked on the paper war that no one had thought to fight yet, while Wyatt Callahan sat across from her and tried to remember the last time someone had sat at this table and made him feel like the problem was solvable. He couldn't remember. He thought it might not have happened before. He went back to the harness and said nothing because there was nothing to say she won, and because sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply stay in the room. At the end of the second week, Clara had a system. Mornings belonged to the house, the kitchen, the meals, the daily management of a household that was slowly, visibly returning to something functional. Noons, when the cowhands were out working and the house was quiet, belonged to the documents. It organized everything into three categories: clean and questionable, urgent. Creek deed went in urgent. Three other contracts with irregularities she couldn't quite name went in questionable. Everything else went in clean. She kept a notebook, neat columns, dates, names, discrepancies, the kind of record that could be presented to a lawyer and understood immediately. During the afternoons that she began to understand the ranch itself, not just as a place where she was temporarily employed, but as a living thing with a history and a character and a set of ongoing concerns that were not so different from the ongoing concerns of any living thing. Attention and care and consistent decisions made on its behalf. Though she was good at that. The cowhands had stopped ignoring her by the end of the first week. Dramatically. Not dramatically. There was no moment of sudden collective respect. No scene where they all turned and acknowledged. It was subtler than that. It was Pete leaving the back door open so she had morning light. Charlie asking her opinion about whether the bunkhouse flower had gone bad and accepting her answer without the quiet man from the east pasture, whose name she had learned was Roy, Sims watching her from across the yard with that particular look that she still could not place. Sims bothered her. She wasn't sure why. He was not rude. He was not overtly hostile. He did his work. He spoke when spoken to, and otherwise kept to himself, which was not particularly unusual for a cowhand on a working ranch. It was something in the way he watched her, specifically in the fraction second too long that his gaze held before he looked away, that made her feel like she was being assessed for something beyond competence. Once she mentioned it to no one. Not yet. She didn't have enough to say. She had was instinct, and instinct needed evidence before it became information. On Thursday of the second week, Wyatt came back from town with his jaw set and his eyes carrying something sharp and unresolved. He was in the kitchen when he came through. She took one look at him and said, "Sit down." He sat, which told her how bad it was. He was not a man who sat when someone told him to, unless he needed to. She poured coffee, placed it in front of him, sat across from him, and waited. Granger came to see me, he said. In town, he pulled me aside at the feed store. He said he heard something, that a man named Aldrich out of Helena has been making inquiries about buying the land anymore. He stopped. What then? She asked. About ownership, Wyatt said. About whether the Callahan title is clean. Kitchen air felt different after he said that. Or somehow, they already know about the deed, Clara said. Isn't a question. Either they know, or they've paid someone to look, and that someone found the same thing you found. His hands were around the coffee cup, but he wasn't drinking. File a challenge on the North Pasture title. It goes to a judge. And if the deed in the county record shows a different boundary than my father's original survey, judge sees a discrepancy that could favor them, Clara said. County, where 3 of the 5 judges have land dealings with Aldrich Associates. He looked at her. His eyes were flat and direct, and she could see the anger in them, real and controlled and very cold. Fighting these men for 18 months with cattle and fences and stubbornness, the wrong weapon. They're not fighting me with cattle, fighting me with paper the whole time, Clara said, and I didn't know. No, she said. Now you do. He stood up abruptly. The way men stand when sitting still has become physically impossible. He went to the window. I have to go to Billings. You should go to Billings, she said. Take the original survey, the deed, and the notes I wrote. Them to a lawyer who has no connection to this valley and tell him everything. She paused. Don't go alone, he turned. I'm not bringing you to. Say bring me, she said. I said don't go alone. Or whoever you trust most besides Deke. She met his look. I've been watching you for 18 months, Wyatt. You didn't. If they know your patterns, if you go to Billings alone, they'll know why, and they'll make their move before you get back. How do you know that? He said. Because that's what my father's creditors did. She said evenly. He went to the bank alone to dispute the terms of his loan. They had already filed the paperwork to seize his assets before he arrived. He knew he was coming because they were watching him, and they moved faster because he moved alone. The kitchen was very quiet. Your father lost his business? Wyatt asked. Everyone. He said carefully, the way you say something when you realize the information you've just received changes your understanding of several previous things. His business, his house, his savings, and his health. In that order, 3 years, he pinned, said. Clara said, he died. 18 months later, my brother got the debts. He got the sewing work to help cover them. She paused. I came west because there was nothing left to come back to. Silence between them was different now, not uncomfortable. It's weighted with something real that hadn't been between them before. He said, Don't, she said quietly. I'm not telling you that for sympathy. I'm telling you because I know what these men look like, how they operate. I've watched them operate. She held his gaze. And I know that the only way to beat them is to move before they expect you to, and to have paper that's cleaner than theirs. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, Come with me. To Billings? Yes, I thought you said. I said I wasn't bringing you in the sense of bringing you into danger, he said. It's in danger. This is a lawyer's office. He paused, and something in his voice shifted to something more careful. Understand these documents better than I do. You found what I missed. You walk into a lawyer's office and try to explain this without you. I'll miss something. Again, he stopped. Not telling. You don't have to go. Clara looked at him. He had offered her a choice every time at the station. Now again, he consistently, saw him, found returning her options to her, as if he understood that the worst thing done to her in Red Hollow was not the humiliation of standing alone on a platform, but the years of a life in which her choices had been made by other people's failures and other people's decisions. Do we leave? She said. Tomorrow morning, he said. We'll have the documents organized by tonight, she said. He nodded once. Then, unexpectedly, thank you. For what specifically, she said. Being the kind of person who finds a thing like this and doesn't keep it to herself. He looked at the table. The previous arrangement was Edwin Wallace, she said. My expectations for men were not high. He made a sound low, brief, that might have been a laugh, ill and unguarded, gone almost before it arrived. She looked up. He was already heading for the door. But for one moment, just one before he turned away, she saw his face without the careful management that he kept over it. Just a man, just tired, just for the span of a breath, grateful that someone was in the room. She filed that away too. Left for Billings at first light, with Deke riding alongside, trembling about his back. He did every time he rode long distance, and which everyone did, including Deke, stood to mean he was prepared to ride however long was necessary. The lawyer's name was Harlan Bell, and he was exactly what a lawyer should be: methodical and impressed by things meant to impress him. Visibly interested in the documents Clara spread before him in a way that had nothing to do with showmanship and everything to do with a man recognizing a genuine problem. Quietly for 15 minutes. Clara and Wyatt and Deke sat in 3 chairs and said nothing. Deke's back hurt. He didn't mention it. Finally, Harlan Bell set down the documents and looked at them over his glasses. Deed alteration is real, he said. I can see it. The ink on the boundary notation is subtly different from the rest of the document. Nib. Possibly different hand. He paused. This is fraud, clearly and demonstrably. He looked at Wyatt. The question is whether we can prove who did it before they file a challenge. How long do we have? Wyatt asked. If they're already making inquiries about the title, days, Harlan said. He leaned back. I need to file a preemptive petition with the district court establishing the original survey as the controlling document. A surveyor to certify the original map, and we need an affidavit from anyone who was present at the 1,880 filing. The man who did the county recording in 1,880 was Tom Harding, Wyatt said. He's still in Red Hollow. Can you trust him? Harlan asked. Wyatt hesitated. Clara watched him hesitate. She watched his jaw tighten fractionally. I thought so, he said. 3 days ago, I would have said yes without question. Now? Harlan pressed. Now I'm asking myself how a deed gets altered before county filing and nobody noticed for 18 years, Wyatt said. And Tom Harding processed every deed in this county for 22 years. The office went very quiet. You think Harding was involved, Clara said. Not an accusation, a careful observation. I think I need to talk to him before I trust him with an affidavit, Wyatt said. And Bell made a note. Find out what you can. I'll begin drafting the petition. Mr. Callahan, he looked up over his glasses. Whoever you're dealing with has deep pockets and local connections. It's not going to resolve quietly. I know, Wyatt said. It will come at you from every angle they can find. Reputation, business relationships. Harlan glanced briefly at Clara. Personal relationships, if they think it will work. Kept her expression neutral. But she noted the glance. So did Wyatt on the ride. Back, when Deke had dropped back 50 yards to rest his back against a slower pace, Wyatt moved his horse alongside hers and said quietly, if this gets difficult for you, personally, you can leave. The 3 months stands regardless. Clara looked at him. You trying to give me an out? I'm trying to make sure you know you have one, he said. Wyatt. She said his name the way he had said hers that first night, putting it somewhere with weight. Found a document that proves fraud against you. To Billings with you. I sat in a lawyer's office and spread evidence on a table. She held his gaze. Now, whether you give me an out or not. Because these are the same men who destroyed my family. And I am not going to ride away and pretend I didn't see what I saw. He looked at her for a long, still moment. You said the same men, he said slowly. He said, the name Aldrich, she said. Harlan said it. That name before. She paused. The man who bought my father's debt, who pushed him into default, and then bought the note and forced the sale, his name was Gerald Aldrich. Sound of hooves on dry ground. The enormous sky overhead. Deke, 50 yards back, quietly managing his horse. Wyatt's voice, when it came, was very still. How old were you? 19, she said. My father was 53. He was dead by 55. Looked at the road ahead for a long time. That's why Edwin, he said. There's no question. That's why Edwin, she said. You have nothing, and someone offers you a future. You take it even when your better instincts tell you to ask more questions. She paused. I asked enough questions to satisfy myself. I didn't ask enough to protect myself. Distinction I live with. Edwin Wallace is an idiot, Deke announced from 50 yards back without turning around. And Wyatt both looked back at him. I can hear fine at this distance, Deke said, still not turning. My back hurts. My ears work. Clara looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at Clara. And this time the almost smile made it all the way to real. It lasted only a second, but she felt it change something in the air between them, something that had been carefully held at a manageable distance, taking one quiet step closer. The road ahead. She looked at the road again and thought, this is going to be complicated. She thought, I already knew that. She thought, it doesn't matter. Matters. The truth matters. The paper that Harlan Bell is drafting right now in Billings matters. Of it, what she felt. When Wyatt Callahan smiled, it meant that she was in a fight against the man who had destroyed her father. It meant that she was no longer simply working for 3 months, but had somehow, without quite deciding to, invested herself in something much larger that would have to wait. Arrived back at the ranch at dusk. She went straight to the kitchen. She needed to move, needed her hands occupied. Needed the specific comfort of work that produced something tangible while her mind sorted through everything that needed sorting. She was starting the stove when she heard it. A sound from the back of the house, from the direction of the room where she kept her documents. Copies, the notes she'd made in her own hand. Organized in her notebook, separate from Wyatt's originals. She set down the kindling. She walked to the hallway, from the door, to the small room she used for her work. Sims was standing at her desk. He had her notebook in his hands. He looked up when she opened the door. For one instant, his face showed exactly what it was. Caught, guilty, and underneath both of those things, not afraid but calculating, of a man rapidly running through his options. Then it smoothed over. He put the notebook down. Miss Whitmore, he said, was looking for Wyatt. Thought he might be. This is my room, she said. Her voice was very steady. She was very afraid and very angry, and she was showing him neither. It was open, Roy said. It was not, she said. He looked at her. That calculating look again. He was trying to figure out what she knew, what she had seen, what she would do with it. And I'll leave you to it, he said. He moved toward the door, stepped aside to let him pass, because she was not going to put herself between him and the exit. And she watched him go down the hallway and out the back and across the yard. She stood in the doorway of her room. Her hands were shaking, and just slightly. She pressed them flat against her sides, looked at her notebook on the desk. It had been moved, not much, but she knew exactly where she'd left it, and it had been moved. He was reading the documents, she thought. He knows what I found, she thought. They have someone inside this ranch. She went to find Wyatt. She found him at the barn, talking to Deke, both of them quiet and tired from the ride. She came through the barn door, and both men looked at her face, and whatever they saw there made them stop talking immediately. Was in my room, she said, reading my notebook. Silence that followed was the silence of two men receiving information that confirms something they had feared, but not wanted to believe. Deke closed his eyes briefly. Wyatt went very still, in a specific way, not shocked still, but the stillness of a man who is deciding things quickly and efficiently. How long has he worked here? Clara asked. 14 months, Deke said. He said it like a man swallowing something bad. Aldrich's people have been after the ranch for 18 months, Clara said. Arithmetic of it sat between all three of them. He came with a reference from Bill Harper, Deke said. Runs the Double Creek, west of here. I trusted the reference. Bill Harper, Clara said. Deke looked at Wyatt. Bill Harper sold his land to Aldrich people in the spring, Wyatt said quietly. It was very still. They didn't just plan the legal attack, Clara said. They put someone inside first, to watch, to report. Be in a position to. She stopped, looked at Wyatt. Things went to court and documents went missing. Be the one to make them disappear. Wyatt finished. Does he know I copied everything and the originals are with Harlan Bell? She asked. Not unless he read that in your notebook, Deke said. He didn't have time, Clara said. He had a minute. She paused. But he knows I found something. He knows. I went to Billings, and tomorrow morning, that information will reach whoever he reports to. Wyatt looked at Deke. Deke looked at Wyatt. Something passed between them, the quick, wordless communication of men who have worked together long enough that some conversations don't need to be spoken. You can't let him leave the property tonight, Deke said. You're not holding a man against his will, Wyatt said immediately. You deal with what comes when he talks, Deke said. Lawyers are for. Wyatt said. He looked at Clara. You all right? He asked. The question landed simply. Performance in it. Just a man asking a woman if she was all right after a frightening moment, with the same directness he brought to everything. She thought about Roy Sims's face when she caught him. A flash of something, calculating behind the guilt. Not frightened, she said, which was not entirely true. Did I want to know something? She looked at Wyatt steadily. Anyone else? On this ranch you're not certain of? Anyone else who came in the last 2 years? Wyatt was quiet for a moment. I'll need to think about that, he said. Think carefully, she said, because whoever these men are, they are patient. You put someone here 14 months ago. They altered a deed 18 years ago and waited for the right moment to use it. She paused. I've been thinking about this longer than we have. The only advantage we have is that we found it first. He held his gaze. Don't waste that advantage, she said. Wyatt Callahan looked at this woman who had arrived at his ranch 6 days ago with a rope-lashed suitcase and nothing else, and who was now standing in his barn, discovered fraud and exposed a spy in a single afternoon, telling him not to waste the advantage. Then he thought about what Deke had said on the ride back. He thought about how Harlan Bell's eyes had tracked across those documents with the recognition of a man encountering something important. He thought about Clara's voice saying, "These are the same men who destroyed my family," he said. Outside the barn, Roy Sims crossed the yard in the last light of the evening and disappeared into the bunkhouse. In the barn, 3 people began planning a war they had not chosen but were not going to lose. Sims was gone before sunrise. Clara knew before anyone told her. The bunkhouse door at 4 in the morning. That specific sound of someone moving with deliberate quiet, the careful footsteps of a man who does not want to be heard, leaving. She lay in the dark in her locked room and listened to him go and did not move because there was nothing to do at 4 in the morning except let him go and prepare for what came next. She was at the kitchen table with her notebook and a fresh pot of coffee when Wyatt came in at 5:30. He took one look at her face. He's gone. Yes, she said. Sometime around 4. He sat down. She poured his coffee without being asked, which she had stopped thinking about as a gesture and started thinking about as simply what happened in the mornings now. He looked at the notebook in front of her. Did he see? Wyatt asked. Not the copies, she said. Enough to confirm that I'd been going through the documents. Enough to tell Aldrich people that we know something. She paused, poured everything he saw. The trip to Billings, the lawyer, all of it. Then they'll move fast, Wyatt said. Before the end of the week, she said. That's my guess. Quiet for a moment, turning the coffee cup in his hands. The file today. I already wrote him a letter, she said. To send with the morning rider if you authorize it. If you authorize it. He looked at her across the table with the expression she had come to recognize, not surprise exactly. More the repeated, quiet adjustment of a man who keeps expecting less and receiving more. Reached across and picked up the letter and read it. Back down. Send it, he said. She nodded. Then there's something else. Lois came up. His eyes came up. I went through the rest of the documents last night, she said. Ones in the questionable pile. I found 2 more problems. She turned the notebook toward him and pointed to the column she'd made. The contract for the East Water. Rights signed by your father in 1877 has a clause on the 3rd page that I don't think he understood when he signed it. It gives the other party the right to reassign the contract without Callahan consent. Wyatt looked at the notation. Who was the other party? A man named Prescott, she said. Does that mean anything to you? He was still. The particular stillness she had learned meant something had landed. Prescott sold his holdings to a Helena investment group 4 years ago, he said slowly. If that investment group is connected to Aldrich, then Aldrich may already own the right to the East Water, Wyatt said. He said it very quietly, and I wouldn't have known. I've gone to court over the North Pasture deed and won. And they would have come at me from the east 6 months later, Clara said. He stood up. He walked to the window. He sheathed his back. She watched the tension across his shoulders, the breath he took that was controlled and deliberate. More, he said. I don't know yet, she said. You've been through about 2/3 of what you have. I'll finish today. He turned around. Clara, he stopped again. I've been fighting these men for 18 months. Lost cattle. I've lost sleep. I've spent money on fences and extra hands, and I have been fighting the wrong battle entirely. Fighting the battle you could see, she said. It's not good enough when the real fight is one you can't see. She agreed. It isn't. She held his gaze. But you can see it now. He looked at her for a long moment. Something was working behind his eyes, not just the immediate problem, but something larger, something that had to do with her specifically, with the fact of her presence at this table on this morning in this house. She could see him reaching for it and then pulling back from it the way a man pulls back from something he's not ready to say. Finish the documents, he said. I'll ride to town and make sure that letter goes out on the first horse. And he picked up his hat. At the door, he stopped. Without turning, thank you. 4th time in 2 weeks. I'm aware I keep saying it. Stop saying it, she said. We're past thank you. Pause. Yes, he said, we are. He left. Clara turned back to the documents. The attack on the cattle came that same afternoon. Not the fence cutting this time. Something worse. Someone had gotten into the North Pasture. Overnight, the same night, Roy Sims disappeared and driven 40 head of cattle through the broken boundary and into the disputed creek land, and 2 of the hands rode out to check the morning count. They found the animals scattered across territory that the Aldrich people could now claim was theirs, with tracks that could be read either as trespass by Callahan cattle or deliberate relocation by Callahan hands. He came back with his face, the color of old leather, and his jaw set like a door bolted against a storm. It's a setup, he said. He was in the kitchen because Clara was in the kitchen, and the kitchen had become, without anyone formally deciding this, the room where things got discussed. The claim, our cattle crossed voluntarily. We can't control our own herd, that the pasture boundaries are unclear, and the cattle themselves prove it. The boundary is where Aldrich says it is, Clara said. That's the argument. That's the argument, Deke said. We need those cattle. Cattle moved back before anyone from Aldrich's side documents their position, Clara said immediately. He sent Pete and Charlie, Deke said. But if someone comes out from town with a county recorder before we get them back, hour, maybe less, Clara stood up. Ride to Tom Harding first, she said. Deke looked at her. You just said last night you didn't trust Harding. I said Wyatt didn't trust him, she said. I said we needed to find out now before anyone else does. If he's clean, he can ride out and certify the cattle's original position before they're moved back. It's a record that contradicts Aldrich's argument. She paused. He's not clean if he refuses. If he already knows, if someone has already been to see him this morning, then we know that too, everyone. And that's information we also need. Deke stared at her. You think fast, he said. Go, she said. He went. Tom Harding rode out. That was the first thing that mattered. He came when Deke asked, without hesitation, felt the deflection of a man who has already been compromised. He rode hard. Znaz which told her something. Guilty men don't ride hard on toward the thing they're guilty about. They find reasons to arrive late. He was 60, red-faced, with the look of a man who had spent his career trying to do a careful job in an imperfect system. He looked at the cattle, he looked at the land, he looked at the boundary markers. And then he looked at Clara, who had ridden out with Deke because she needed to see it herself. And he said, You. Whitmore, she said. I managed the Callahan household. We found the deed problem, Deke said. Tom Harding went very still. What Deed problem. What deed problem? He said. And the way he said it, the specific quality of the question, the slight tightening around his eyes told Clara that this was not the question of a man who knew, the question of a man who was afraid of what he was about to learn. North pasture deed, she said carefully. Filed in June of 1880. The notation differs from the original survey by 12. Tom Harding's face did something complicated. It moved through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, then comprehension, then a dawning, terrible recognition. The deed went through my office. He said. Yes, Clara said. We processed hundreds of deeds that year, he said. He's talking faster now, the way people talk, when they are seeing something clearly for the first time and are horrified by what they see. I signed the filings, but I didn't personally transcribe everyone. We had a deputy that year, a young man named, he stopped. This is his name. Clara said. Fletcher, Tom Harding said. Daniel Fletcher. He worked for me 8 months in 1880 and then left for Helena. He paused. Said he had a better position. In Helena, Clara said. Helena, Tom Harding repeated. And then, because he was a man who had spent his career in county records and understood what those two words meant, placed together in this context, Lord Almighty. Will you sign an affidavit? Clara said, stating that the filing was processed by your deputy and that you had no knowledge of any alteration to the boundary notation. He looked at her. Yes, he said, no hesitation. The answer of a man who has realized that a wrong was done under his authority and who is not going to add to it by protecting himself at someone else's expense. Yes, I'll sign whatever Harlan Bell needs. The cattle were being pushed back across the boundary by Pete and Charlie behind them. Of their position, documented by Tom Harding himself, who had ridden out and personally witnessed the location before the move would go into the court filing. One angle closed. Clara turned her horse back toward the ranch, knowing that 2 more angles were still open and that Aldrich people would find them before the week was out. She was right. The letter arrived on Wednesday. It was addressed to Wyatt, on the formal letterhead of a Helena law firm. Informed him that a title dispute had been filed with the district court regarding the north pasture boundary, and that pending resolution of the dispute, cattle operations in the affected area should cease, and that any transfer or sale of the property was hereby encumbered. Wyatt read it at the kitchen table. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at Clara. They filed Monday, he said, the same day Roy left. They had the filing prepared before Roy left, Clara said. He just confirmed the timing. Wyatt's face was absolutely controlled. She had learned that this was when he was most dangerous, not when he showed anger, but when he didn't. The control was so complete that the emotion underneath it had nowhere to go and simply compressed. Petition, she said. Did it go out Monday? Ryder, he said. Then we filed first, she said. Possibly, but first, Harlan's preemptive petition establishes our position before their challenge. She paused, but it's not lost. They'll fight the petition, he said. They have judges. We have Tom Harding affidavit and the original survey map, she said. Lawyer, who has no local connections and no reason to bend. Quiet. Wyatt, she said. Look at me. He looked at her. We've not lost this ranch, she said. Not today, while I'm sitting at this table. She said it not as comfort but as fact, with the same directness he brought to everything, giving it back to him in a language he could receive. Something in his face shifted. Not relief too soon for relief, but something that looked like a man finding his footing. One more thing I need to tell you, he said, when his voice had a quality she hadn't heard before, careful in a different way. But not the care of a man managing information, but the care of a man approaching something that cost him something to say. About the East Water contract, he said. The one with the Prescott clause. Wentz, I knew about that clause, he said. Clara went still. When my father signed it, Wyatt said. I found it 3 years ago, when I went through his papers after his death. I knew the clause existed. I thought Prescott was gone and his holdings were dissolved, and I told myself it didn't matter anymore. He paused. I told myself that because dealing with it would have meant admitting my father had been taken advantage of, and I wasn't ready to do that. The kitchen was very quiet. So when Prescott sold to the Helena Group, Clara said slowly, "What it might mean," he said, and I did nothing. Her gaze steadily. He was not looking for absolution. He was telling her the truth because she had earned the truth and because he was fundamentally a man who could not sustain a dishonesty once he had decided someone deserved honesty. "You telling me now," she said. "Because you're going to find it anyway," he said. "Working through those documents, you'll find my notation on the contract margin, the one I made 3 years ago when I read the clause." He paused. "I didn't want you to find it and think I'd been hiding things from you." I looked at him. She thought about everything she knew about this man in 3 weeks. On her suitcase, the room with a lock, the coffee, the trip to Billings, the way he said, "Don't apologize for thinking," the way he kept giving her choices. And now this, the deliberate offering of truth that it made him look worse, simply because she deserved to have it. "You made a mistake," she said. "You made it out of grief, and you knew it, and you've been carrying it." She paused. "That's not the same as what they did to your father. And it's not the same as what Roy Sims did. Don't put yourself in that category." He said nothing. "But," she said, "I need to know right now, is there anything else? Anything at all that you know and haven't told me?" Her gaze for the full length of that question. She said. She believed him, not blindly, not because she wanted to, but because she had spent 3 weeks learning to read this man, and the face that looked back at her across the kitchen table was the face of someone who had just handed over everything he had and was standing with empty hands. "Then here's what we do," she said. She pulled the notebook toward her. "Prescott Claus Harlan needs to know about it. We can't let Aldrich lawyers find it before we address it ourselves." "It's our position," Wyatt said. "Hiding it destroys our position," Clara said, disclosing it and framing it correctly, that we identified it, that we have challenged the assignment through Harlan's filing gives us control of the narrative. She was already writing. "One, the moment you reveal a problem before your opponent does, you take their weapon away." She stopped writing, looked up. "My father's lawyer never told him that," she said quietly. "He wished for years that someone had." The silence between them was the most honest silence. They had yet shared two people who had both been on the losing end of men who used paper as weapons, sitting at a kitchen table in Montana, deciding together that it would not happen again. "The letter to Harlan today?" he said. "I'll have it written in an hour," she said. He nodded. He stood. He moved toward the door, and then he stopped, not the way he usually stopped, not the practical pause of a man remembering something he needed to say. A man stops when there's something he wants to say that he hasn't yet found the right words for. She looked up. "When this is over," he said. He stopped again. "I mean, however it ends. When the court decides," she said. When he looked at her with that unfiltered directness, Ethan, and she saw behind it something that was not managed, not controlled, not the careful presentation of a man who has learned to keep things back. Just a man. Just honest, just terrified of the wrong thing. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not because the ranch needs a manager. He stopped. "Try it again, because I want you to stay. That have nothing to do with the household." Yeah, held very still. "That's the most careful declaration I've ever heard," she said. Something flickered across his face. "I'm not good at this. Better than you think," she said. She looked at him steadily. "Me again when this is over. When I'm not in the middle of writing a legal letter, and when neither of us is afraid of losing the ranch." "It's a not yet," she said, "which is not a no." He gazed for one long moment. Then he nodded. Precise, the nod of a man who has received information he will put somewhere safe and return to. He left. Clara looked at the blank page in front of her. Then she put her pen to it. She wrote the date. She wrote, "Dear Mr." Outside, the sky was enormous, and the land was threatened, and the men who had destroyed her family were marshaling everything they had for a final push against a ranch that had stood for 30 years and a man who had stood for all of it alone. "Alone anymore?" She wrote faster. Harlan Bell's response came on Friday. 2 pages. dense and precise, the handwriting of a man who understood that every word in a legal document carried weight and chose them accordingly. Read it first because she was the one who heard the rider come in, and because Wyatt was out in the north pasture doing what ranchers do when they are afraid of losing something, working it harder than, as if labor itself were a form of holding on. Standing in the hallway, still in her apron, and by the time she reached the second page, her hand was pressed flat against the wall because she needed something solid. And had filed the preemptive petition. The original survey map had been certified by an independent surveyor he'd sent from Billings on Tuesday. Tom Harding's affidavit was in. The petition established the Callahan claim with enough documented support that a legitimate judge, his word, legitimate, would have serious difficulty ruling against it. But there was a but, and it was on the second page, and it was the kind of but that changes everything that came before it. Aldrich had filed not one challenge, but three. The North Pasture deed was the first. The Prescott Water Clause, which they had disclosed proactively, exactly as Clara had said, was the second. It was something none of them had seen coming. To lien. Filed against the Callahan Ranch in 1882 for a debt allegedly owed by Wyatt's father to a Helena lending company. $1,600. Never paid, according to the filing. With 4 years of compounded interest now attached, the total sum claimed was over $4,000. Lynn's note at the bottom of the second page was not legal language. It was a man writing plainly because the situation required it. No record of this lien in any county filing I can access. It's filed in a jurisdiction I haven't yet searched, or it is fraudulent. I need 3 more days. Do not make any public statements, and do not allow anyone from Aldrich's party on the property. Folded the letter carefully. She stood in the hallway for a moment, being the thing she did. When information was bad, not panicking, not catastrophizing. Done. Simply sitting with the weight of it until it became something she could carry, rather than something that was carrying her. To find Wyatt, she found him at the fence line. He saw her coming from a distance, and something in how she walked made him stop working before she reached him. People, the way he read weather, early, accurately, without needing to wait for it to arrive. She handed him the letter. He read it. Both pages. The second page twice. He folded it exactly the way she had folded it. He handed it back. He looked at the fence line for a long moment. My father didn't have a debt with a Helena lending company, he said. She said, he didn't borrow from Helena. He didn't trust Helena banks. He said the interest rates were criminal and the men who ran them were worse. He paused. Load locally or not at all. Harlan thinks it may be fraudulent, she said. He needs 3 days to search the filings. 3 days is a long time, Wyatt said. She agreed. He looked at her. How bad is this? He didn't soften it. He didn't want it softened. She had wanted early. That softening things for Wyatt Callahan was a waste of both their time. If the lien is real and the debt is real, they can force a sale to satisfy it, she said. $1,000 against a ranch. That's already in a title dispute. No bank will lend against it. You have no way to pay it except to sell. And if it's fraudulent, prove it, she said. And we add it to the case against them. Fraudulent lien filing is a serious crime. She paused. You have to prove it. And we have to prove it in 3 days. He turned away from the fence. He started walking back toward the ranch without saying where he was going, which meant he already knew and didn't need to explain it. She kept pace beside him. My father's financial records, he said. Every bank statement, every receipt, every ledger he kept. Been through those yet? She said. They're in the back room in the trunk under his survey maps. Night, he said. Yes, she said. They walked in silence for a moment. The kind of silence that is not empty but full of the shared understanding of two people who have been fighting the same fight. Long enough that they no longer need to narrate it to each other. Then Wyatt said, quietly, I keep thinking about what you said, that these are the same men who took your father's business, she said, and now they're coming after everything my father built. He paused. Something almost, I don't know the word, particular, she said. Like they chose us, specifically. He glanced at her sideways. Did they? She had been thinking about this. She'd been thinking his words since Wednesday. She had been thinking about it since Wednesday, turning it over, looking at the angles of it. She said finally, I don't think we were chosen specifically. I think men like Aldrich move through a landscape and take what they can reach, and we happen to be in the landscape. She paused. But that doesn't make it less personal. It just makes it more important to stop them. He's after us. There's someone else. He was quiet. There's always someone else, she said. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man receiving something true and filing it alongside the other true things. The ranch. He held the door for her, which he always did, which she had stopped it marking on internally because it had become part of the texture of the days. He said as she passed him. She stopped. Whatever happens with the court, he said, or Harlan finds, I want you to know something. He waited. You came here with a broken suitcase, he said. Weeks. You have done more for this ranch and for me than anyone in the last 5 years. He stopped. I said ask me again when this is over. But I don't want you to think that's the only reason. That I'm saying what I said because I need something from you. He looked at him. I know that, she said quietly. Wyatt, you offered me fair wages and a room with a lock before you knew I could read a contract. She held his gaze. You saw me as a person before you knew I was useful to you. It's not something I'm going to forget. He looked at her with that open, unmanaged expression that came through sometimes when his guard dropped without him noticing. He said, good. He went inside. Ella stood in the doorway. For one moment, looking at nothing in particular, feeling something move through her that was warm and solid and slightly terrifying. The way real things feel when you've been living among provisional things for so long that the real thing catches you off guard. Inside, too, they worked until midnight, held 40 years of Jacob Callahan's financial life, organized in the meticulous way of a man who trusted records because he had learned young that memory betrayed you and paper didn't. Transaction noted. Every debt and payment and receipt and correspondence with banks and merchants, aunts and suppliers across 20 years of ranching. There's no Helena Lending Company. Not in 1882. Not in any year. With this one, filed between a cattle purchase receipt from 1881 and a property tax record. From 1883, it was a letter. Go page, unsigned, written in a hand that was careful to the point of artificiality, the hand of someone disguising their natural writing, to Jacob Callahan, warning him in terms that were polite on the surface and threatening underneath, that certain parties had an interest in the Creek territory and that cooperation would be in the family's best interest. Wyatt held that letter and read it and said nothing for a long time. Clara said, he kept everything, Wyatt said. He knew what it was, she said. He knew someone was threatening him and he kept the evidence. She paused. Her father was smarter than they thought he was. Wyatt set the letter down very carefully, with the specific gentleness of a man handling something that has just become more valuable than it appeared, Clara said. Combined with the fraudulent lien, combined with the deed alteration, combined with Tom Harding's affidavit about Daniel Fletcher Harlan, can build a pattern, just a property dispute, a coordinated, decades-long campaign of fraud and intimidation against your family. She looked at Wyatt. Changes the case entirely. That's not the title challenge. Criminal matter. Can Harlan take it that far? Wyatt said. Can take it to someone who can, she said. Picked up the letter carefully by its edges. Dated September 1882. To Jacob Callahan. Kept all these years in a trunk under survey maps, waiting for someone to find it. Father held on to this for a reason, she said. Because he was stubborn. Wyatt said, and his voice was rough in a way it hadn't been before. Because he knew someday it would matter, she said. He looked at her. His eyes were bright in the lamplight, with something he wasn't going to name and didn't need to. Send it to Harlan tomorrow, he said. First rider, she said, was set for the following Thursday. Red Hollow turned out for it. The way Red Hollow turned out for everything that mattered completely. with an opinion already formed and a willingness to revise it if the evidence was sufficiently dramatic. The meeting hall held 60 people standing and had 80 in it by the time the judge called the room to order. I sat at the table beside Harlan Bell. Wyatt sat on her other side. Deke was behind them, which he had decided without anyone suggesting it, his arms crossed and his expression communicating that any person who attempted anything would be dealing with him personally. His lawyers were three. Expensive suits, Helena polish, the particular confidence of men who had done this before, and one was not intimidated by confidence. She had grown up watching confident men take everything her father had. Presented the preemptive petition first. Original survey. Tom Harding's affidavit. The independent surveyor's certification. He laid it out in the methodical, unhurried way of a man who knows he has what he needs and does not require drama to prove it. His lead lawyer, a man named Cassidy with silver hair and a voice trained for rooms, responded with the title challenge. The altered deed, the boundary discrepancy. The claim that the Callahan cattle had been grazing on disputed land for years was very quiet. Then Harlan introduced the letter. Introduced it simply. He described where it had been found and by whom. He did aloud. He read every word of it. The polite surface and the threat underneath everyone, and he let the year on it 1882 sit in the room's air for a moment before he said, Honor, the Callahan family has been subject to coordinated pressure regarding this specific land for over 40 years. The deed, alteration, the fraudulent lien, the placement of an informant on the ranch payroll, these are not separate incidents. The campaign, Cassidy was on his feet. Objection. This is a civil hearing, Mr. Cassidy. Listen, not a trial, Ethan, the judge said. Sit down. He looked at Harlan, the lien. Fraudulent, Your Honor, Harlan said. Filed in a Helena court in 1882 using forged documentation. Affidavits from two Billings bank officers confirming that Jacob Callahan held no debt with any Helena institution at any time. The filing references a lending company that upon investigation, was incorporated for 6 months in 1082 and dissolved with no record of any actual lending activity. Erupted, not loudly. It was the particular sound of 60 people all turning to the person next to them and saying something at the same moment, a wave of urgent whispered sound. Clara kept her eyes on the judge. The judge kept his eyes on the documents in front of him, saying something fast and polished about procedural concerns and the need for further verification and the complexity of historical filings. The judge held up one hand. Cassidy stopped. The judge looked at the letter. He looked at the survey map. He looked at Tom Harding's affidavit. He looked at Harlan Bell's petition with its clean, documented, methodical evidence. He looked at Cassidy. Counselor, he said, in 30 years on this bench, I have seen legitimate title disputes, and I have seen campaigns. You know the difference. He set down the documents. Need your clients to answer some questions about the 1,882 lending company, and I am going to need them answered under oath. Convene in 2 weeks. He paused. In the meantime, the Callahan title stands. Encumbrance, no lien. All cattle operations continue as normal. His face was composed. His eyes were not. Wyatt's hand under the table found Clara's. It was a brief contact, just a moment, just the specific pressure of one person's hand, telling another person something that neither of them had quite put into words yet. He felt it move through her from her hand to somewhere central, something that had been held tight for a very long time, loosening by 1 degree. The judge was standing and the room was filling with sound, and Deke was saying something very emphatic to Charlie behind them. And Harlan was gathering his papers with the focused efficiency of a man already thinking about the next step. Wyatt let go of her hand. He stood, he helped her up. It's not over, she said quietly. It wasn't. Because it was one. Because Cassidy and Aldrich would find another angle, he agreed. But we're ahead of them for the first time. Bus there, she said. He looked at her with that full, direct, unmanaged expression. And that's the plan. It was Cassidy who came to her. She had expected something. She hadn't expected it to be this direct. 3 days after the hearing in the general store when she was alone, and Wyatt was at the North Pasture, and Deke was at the feed store across the street. He was polite. He was always polite. It was the politeness of a man who has learned to deliver threats without the words ever technically being threats. He said that his clients had a great deal of respect for her intelligence. He said they understood she had come to Red Hollow in difficult circumstances. And he said they wanted her to know that there were other options available to a woman of her capabilities, opportunities in Helena, with people who could be very generous to someone who understood how things worked. Let him finish. Then she said, "You're offering me money to stop helping Wyatt Callahan." He smiled. "I'm suggesting that your current position is temporary by its own terms, and that you're offering me money." She said again, "Because your clients are afraid of what I've already found and what I might find next." His smile stayed. His eyes didn't. "Miss Whitmore, Aldrich destroyed my father," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. "He bought his debt and forced his default, and my father was dead within 2 years. He came west on a promise from a man who couldn't keep it. And I landed on Wyatt Callahan's ranch. And inside 2 weeks, I found evidence that the same man who destroyed my family has been committing fraud against the Callahans for 40 years. She paused. "There's no amount of money. There is no opportunity in Helena. There's nothing you can offer me that will make me stop." Z looked at her for a long moment. "You understand," he said, "that this makes you an obstacle." "I understand," she said, "that I have always been an obstacle to men like your clients. It says that now I have a lawyer and a rancher and a county recorder and a judge, who's paying attention." She picked up her basket. "Mr. Cassidy," she walked out. Her hands were shaking by the time she reached the street. She pressed them flat against her skirt and walked steadily toward where Deke's horse was tied, because she was not going to let anyone in Red Hollow see her shake. Deke was at the doorway of the feed store. He had seen Cassidy go in. He had positioned himself where he could see the door. He looked at her face. "You all right?" "He offered me money to leave," she said. Deke's expression did something that was almost impressively unfriendly. "You say," he said. "I said no," she said. Sentences. Deke looked at her for a moment. Then he said gruffly, in the tone of a man who finds directness about feeling uncomfortable, but does it anyway. "Wyatt's mother would have liked you." Looked at him. "Don't tell him I said that," Deke said immediately, already turning back to the feed store. Insufferable. She almost laughed, real and sudden, catching her by surprise. Go back to the ranch with the shaking gone from her hands. And something warm and certain in its place. The specific feeling of a person who has been offered an exit and has looked at it clearly and chosen to stay, not because she had no choice, but because she had every choice. And this was the one she wanted. She was still thinking about that when she came through the ranch gate and found Wyatt waiting in the yard, which he never did, which meant someone had told him about Cassidy, already probably Pete, who had been at the general store. Down from the horse and looked at him. "I heard," he said. "Then you know I said no," she said. "Yes." He looked at her with that open, full expression. "Wyatt," she said. "The 3 months," he said. "Up in 4 days." She had not forgotten. She had been aware of it the way you are, aware of a change in weather before it arrives. She said, "I told you I'd ask again when it was over," he said. "It's not over. The case isn't settled. Cassidy is still out there." He paused. "But I'm asking anyway, because I don't want to wait anymore, and because you deserve to know where I stand regardless of what you decide." He held her gaze steadily. "I want you to stay because the ranch needs you. I want you to stay because the case needs you. I want you to stay because I want you here. Because this house is different with you in it, and I am different with you in it, and I'm not ready to go back to what it was before." The yard was quiet. Somewhere Pete was diplomatically invisible. "You said," Clara said, "on that first day, no man should decide a woman's future because he has power over her." He said, "You meant it." Every word, he said. "You understand," she said. "Everyone." that I'm going to give you an answer, not because I need somewhere to go, but because I want to. He said. That's the only answer I want. She looked at him. This man, who had crouched in the dirt beside her and picked up her mother's Bible, and said, a woman who traveled this far deserves more than humiliation. This man who had given her wages and a lock and choices at every turn. This man who had told her his failure because she deserved the truth. This man who had sat across a kitchen table in the dark and simply stayed in the room. She said, I'm staying. He held her gaze. Something moved across his face that she had not seen there before, not the almost smile, not the careful management, not the controlled steadiness of a man holding himself together under pressure. Something open and real and slightly undone. The face of a person receiving something they had wanted and had not been certain they would get. Out and took her hand, not briefly, this time. Not the fleeting contact under the courtroom table. He held it the way a man holds something he intends to keep. Days ago, you were a stranger bride nobody wanted, he said quietly. Days ago, I was the stranger bride nobody wanted, she agreed. They do, he said. He held her hand in the yard of the ranch that was still threatened and still fighting, under a sky that was enormous and indifferent to human trouble. By Whitmore, who had come west with a broken suitcase and $17 and a letter she had read 47 times, felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, exactly where she was supposed to be. Not saved, not rescued, not placed somewhere by someone else's decision, standing exactly where she had chosen to stand. That was everything. The 2 weeks before the reconvened hearing were the longest of Clara's life, and she had lived through some long ones. Did not come back to her directly. He was smarter than that. He did instead was quieter and more corrosive. The kind of campaign that doesn't announce itself through whisper, implication, and the slow erosion of reputation that happens when a community starts hearing the same story from enough different mouths. The story was this. Clara Whitmore was an outsider. She had come west to marry a man who thought better of it. She had inserted herself into the Callahan Ranch's legal troubles for reasons that served her own interests. She was not a woman helping a rancher fight fraud. She was a woman using a legal dispute to secure a position she couldn't obtain honestly. She heard it first from Pete, who told her directly because he was a young man who had decided she deserved to know what was being said rather than protected from it. She heard it second from the woman at the dry goods store who went quiet in a particular way. Clara, when Clara came in, that said more than any words would have. Third from Deke, who heard it at the feed store and came home with his jaw set and a look on his face that suggested several people in Red Hollow had narrowly avoided a very uncomfortable conversation. Tell Wyatt immediately, not because she was protecting him, because she needed to sit with it first, to understand what it was doing to her, to separate the part that was just painful from the part that was actually dangerous. The painful part, it was working. She could feel it in small ways, the slight hesitation before people met her eyes, the conversations that stopped when she walked into a room. Red Hollow was slowly sorting itself into the people who had decided about her and the people who were still deciding. She was used to being judged. She was not used to being judged deliberately, as a strategy, by people who were doing it because she was effective. The dangerous part, if the community turned against her, it would be harder to hold the hearing. Judges were not immune to the atmosphere of a room. Bell was good, but he was from Billings, and the judge was local, and local meant something in a town this size. She thought about it for 2 days. Then she made a decision. When she went to see Margaret Hollis. Margaret Hollis was 63 years old, lived in Red Hollow. For 31 of those years, 4 children, a husband, the town's small lending library out of the back of her house for the past decade. She was the kind of woman that towns like Red Hollow organized themselves around without ever formally acknowledging it, the person to whom other people brought their genuine questions because she was known to give genuine answers. He had spoken to her twice, brief, practical exchanges, but she had watched everyone the way she watched everyone, and what she had seen was a woman of considerable intelligence who had chosen reasons of her own invest that intelligence in her community rather than in leaving it. She knocked on Margaret's door on a toasty afternoon, opened it, looked at Clara, lens, and said, "I wondered when you'd come," told Clara. That Margaret already knew why she was there and had been waiting for her to figure out that she should be. She went in. Margaret made tea, 20. They sat at a kitchen table, not unlike the one Clara had been working at for 3 weeks, Lee said. And Clara said, plainly and without softening it, "One is running a campaign against my character in this town. You know more about what this town thinks than anyone. You need to know how much damage has been done." Margaret looked at her steadily. "More than you'd like," she said. "Less than they want. People believe." "People believe what's easiest to believe," Margaret said. "Now it's easy to believe that a woman who arrived as a rejected bride and ended up in the middle of a legal fight over the biggest ranch in the valley is there for her own purposes." She paused. "Not because people are cruel, because it's a pattern they've seen before, men who use circumstances." "I know," Clara said. Margaret said, "This town also watched Edwin Wallace humiliate you on a train platform and watched Wyatt Callahan walk through a crowd to stand beside. The town has been watching the Callahan Ranch slowly come back to life in the past 3 weeks. When the kitchen light on before dawn, the hands who used to eat in silence, eating like men who feel they belong somewhere." She set down her teacup. "People notice those things too." "Which way does it fall?" Clara asked. Looked at her directly. "That depends," she said, "on whether you give them something real to hold on to. Now you're a story being told by two sides, and people are choosing based on which version they find more comfortable." She paused. "Give them something that isn't a version. Give them something that's just true." Sat with that. "What would you do?" she asked. "Call a meeting," Margaret said, simply. "Not about the legal case. The children." Clara looked at her. "There are 14 children on ranches within 5 miles of here," Margaret said, "who have no schooling past what their mothers can give them. Families pulled their older children out last winter to help with work, and those children haven't gone back." She held Clara's gaze. "Pete last week that the bunkhouse could be used for something in the evenings. He told Charlie. Charlie told his wife. His wife told me." Margaret almost smiled. "You tell him this town talks, Miss Whitmore. The question is what it talks about." Looked at the woman across the table from her. She thought, this is what it looks like when someone who has lived in a place for 30 years decides to help you. Grand gesture. A door opened at exactly the right angle. "You'll need books," Clara said. "I have books," Margaret said. "And someone the parents trust to vouch for the intention." "Trust you," Margaret said. "That'll do for a start." The meeting was on Thursday evening, 5 days before the reconvened hearing. Families came, not all of them friendly. Some of them came out of the same curiosity that had drawn people to the train platform 3 weeks ago, the sense that something was happening that they should see for themselves. Stood in front of them in the Callahan ranch yard, and she did not make a speech. Thought about making a speech and had decided against it because speeches were what he wanted, what people made when they wanted to tell you who they were. And she was performing herself for audiences who hadn't yet decided about her. Instead, she said, "I'm starting a school. 2 evenings a week in the bunkhouse. A child who wants to come is welcome. Any parent who wants to sit in is welcome. I'm not asking for anything, except the children." A man near the back, she didn't know his name, broad-shouldered, the look of a man who had formed his opinion, already said, "You're getting out of it." He went very still. Clara looked at him. "Nothing," she said, "except that I know what it is to have a father who taught you to read a contract, and how much that's worth when the wrong people come for what you own." She paused. "These children live on land that people will try to take from them someday, them to be harder to take from." Silence. A woman, near the front young, a child on her hip, said quietly, "When do you start?" "Monday," Clara said. 7 children came on Monday, came on Wednesday. By the following Monday, there were 15, from 6 to 14, sitting on bunkhouse benches with borrowed books. Clara moved between them, with the specific patience of a woman who understood that learning was not a performance you gave, but a thing you built slowly with consistent attention. 1. Wyatt watched from the doorway on the second evening for a few minutes, it's long enough to see what it was. He went back to his work without saying anything, which was its own kind of statement. Deke, who had appointed himself unofficial guardian of the bunkhouse during school hours, told Pete afterward, she's not here for the ranch. She's here for something bigger than the ranch. Pete had the wisdom not to repeat this to Wyatt. Reconvened on a Thursday morning. Was fuller than the first time. Clara noticed that immediately. People who had not come to the first hearing had come to this one, which meant word had traveled and the community had decided this mattered enough to witness. She saw Margaret Hollis near the back, and she saw Charlie's wife, who nodded at her once, briefly, with the specific nod of a woman, communicating something that doesn't need words. 1. She saw Edwin Wallace near the side wall, which she hadn't expected. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the floor with the expression of a man who has realized too late that he made a significant error in judgment and is now watching its consequences play out. She did not feel satisfaction about that. She felt nothing about it at all. Wallace was a closed door, and she had stopped looking at closed doors. And Bell presented first. He had 3 weeks more of work than the first hearing, and it showed. Vigilant lien evidence was airtight. 2 sworn affidavits from Helena Bank officers, documentation that the 1082 lending company had been incorporated for the specific purpose of filing false line scenes and dissolved immediately after, and the name of the man who had filed the incorporation papers, a man named Fletcher, Daniel Fletcher, who had worked as Tom Harding's deputy in 1880 and had gone to Helena for a better position. The same man who had altered the Callahan deed before filing it. When Harlan read the name aloud, the room made that sound again, that wave of whispered urgency, but louder this time. Because this was not an abstract legal argument anymore. This was a name, a specific, visible human being who had been paid to commit fraud against a family in this valley, who had done it in 2 separate ways 18 years apart, and who was currently employed by a land management company in Helena, whose majority shareholder was Gerald Aldrich. He was on his feet. He argued procedure. He argued jurisdiction. He argued the complexity of historical documentation and the unreliability of 40-year-old records. Polished, and he was fast, and he was very good at making legitimate arguments sound like obstruction without being technically wrong about any of them. The judge listened. Then the judge said, "Mr. Cassidy, your client's employee committed provable fraud against the Callahan family on at least 2 documented occasions spanning 18 years. The title challenge is dismissed. The lien is void. The Callahan title is clean and unencumbered." He paused. I'm also referring the documentation regarding Daniel Fletcher and the 1882 lending company to the territorial prosecutor. It's no longer a civil matter. Cassidy said nothing. The first time in this entire ordeal, Cassidy said absolutely nothing. Erupted. Not the whispered urgency of the first hearing real sound, the sound of 60 people simultaneously exhaling something they had been holding. Turned to Clara and said, the fiston, with the professional understatement of a man who had won cases before and knew better than to perform about it. Well done, Miss Whitmore. Sat very still for a moment. She thought about a letter she had read 47 times on a train coming west. She thought about a platform in the dirt with her things scattered around her feet. So every others. She thought about her fuzz face the morning the bankmen came. Boost. She thought about Gerald Aldrich's name spoken in a Philadelphia accounting office when she was 19 years old. The first time she understood that some people treated other people's lives as resources to be extracted. She thought, it doesn't bring them back, her father. The life Edwin Wallace had promised and failed to deliver. None of this gives those things back. But it stops it from happening to the next person. When sometimes that has to be enough, she stood. Wyatt was already standing, and he looked at her. and neither of them said anything for a moment, because some moments are complete without language, and forcing words into them is a way of making them smaller. Then Deacon, who was standing directly behind them, said in his caring voice, "You go home now?" He went, "My back is killing me." 2 months later, Wyatt Callahan asked Clara Whitmore to marry him. He did not do it dramatically. He was not a dramatic man. He did it in the kitchen, on a Tuesday morning before the light had fully come in. Once, on her second cup of coffee, when she was on her second cup of coffee and going over the school schedule, and he was supposed to be heading out to the north pasture. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. "I want to ask you something," he said. She set down her pen. He came and sat across from her, which was where he always sat, the specific chair that had become, without any formal arrangement, his chair in relation to her chair. The seating arrangement of two people who have been across a table from each other through enough hard things that the configuration has become something they return to instinctively. He looked at her. "Marry me," he said, not a command. Very still. Not quite a question. The statement of a man naming something he wants clearly enough that it doesn't need the performance of uncertainty. Looked at him. She thought about arriving in Red Hollow with a broken suitcase and $17. She thought about the rope he'd used to fix the latch. She thought about the room with a lock and the key he'd given her and the coffee he'd made without being asked. She thought about him saying, "Don't apologize for thinking," and meaning every syllable. About his hand, finding hers under the courtroom table, and the 2 months since then, and what those 2 months had felt like, not the absence of difficulty, not the resolution of every complication, but the specific quality of living beside someone who consistently, in the smallest moments and the largest ones, treated her as a person whose interior life was as complicated and valuable as his own. He thought, "I came west because I had nothing to go back to." She thought, "I'm staying because I have everything to stay for," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. He didn't say anything else. Neither did she. Outside, the north pasture waited, and the school schedule sat on the table between the coffee cups, and the day was beginning the way days do, without ceremony, without announcement, gone, in just the ordinary ongoing fact of a life that had somehow, despite every effort of circumstance to prevent it, become exactly what it was supposed to be. Married in October, when the valley was turning and the light had gone gold and low. Hall stood at the front of the small gathering. Deke stood beside Wyatt and managed to look simultaneously proud and inconvenienced, which was his natural resting expression, and which everyone present understood as the highest form of emotional investment he was capable of displaying. Tibbin, the children from the school were there. 15 of them, in their best clothes, sitting in a row with the particular solemnity of children who understand they are witnessing something important without entirely understanding why. Wore her mother's dress, and she had mended it herself. In the evenings, the same blue dress that had been covered in dust on the platform at Red Hollow had been her humiliation, and her arrival and her beginning. Cleaned it and pressed it and let out the seams, where her hands had done 9 months of harder work than the seamstress had accounted for. She wore it, not because she had forgotten what happened in it, but because she refused to let that day be the only thing the dress remembered. When the ceremony was done, and Wyatt looked at her that open, unmanaged expression she had first seen through his careful management 3 weeks into knowing him, the face of a man receiving something he had not been certain he would get, she thought, this is what it means to be chosen, not convenient, not the best available option given the circumstances, freely, by someone who understood exactly what they were choosing. Years that followed were not simple. Worth having is simple. There were hard winters and difficult seasons, and the ongoing work of two people sharing a life, which is never as easy as the moment of choosing it. Arguments, real ones, the kind that happen between people who care enough to fight, and reconciliations, and the slow accumulation of all the ordinary moments that make up a life lived together. Aldrich operation in the Montana Valley collapsed 18 months after the hearing, When the territorial prosecutor's investigation expanded beyond the Callahan case to include 7 other fraudulent lien filings across the region, Dan Fletcher testified. 3 members of the Helena Land Management Company were indicted. Himself, facing federal scrutiny, his remaining Montana holdings at a significant loss and retreated to the east, where he spent the remainder of his career in considerably reduced circumstances. Did not feel triumph when she heard that. She felt the specific, quiet satisfaction of a ledger brought into balance, wrong given its correct weight. At last, the school grew. It moved from the bunkhouse to a proper building that the ranching families built together over 2 summers, and it eventually employed a second teacher, a young woman from Billings, who came westet with considerably better circumstances than Clara had, and who found, to considerable surprise, that the school already had an established culture of precision, directness, belief that what you know is a form of protection against what the world might do to you. The children who sat in that first bunkhouse session on Monday evenings grew up. Some left Red Hollow. Some stayed. All of them could read a contract by the time they were 12. Wyatt Callahan became known in the valley, and eventually beyond it, as something more than the rancher who had survived a land fraud campaign. He became known as the man who had, in the single act of crossing a train platform, set something in motion that changed the texture of an entire community, who had said, in front of 60 witnesses, she's not alone, and had meant it in every way that a man can mean something. Stop being surprised by Clara. That was perhaps the most important thing about him, that after years of knowing her, he retained the capacity to find her remarkable. Not in a way that was about her being unusual, in a way that was about paying attention. He paid attention to her the way he paid attention to the land, with the understanding that the same ground can tell you something different every day if you are willing to keep looking. She kept the notebook with them. Chili. Eventually, the one from the kitchen table in those first weeks, the ones from the legal fight, the ones from the school, the ones she used in later years, when other families in the valley came to her with documents and contracts that looked wrong, which they did with increasing frequency, because it became known that Clara Callahan could find the thing that shouldn't be there. It's her mother's letter to Tang. She kept her mother's letter. She read it less often as the years went on, not because she had moved away from it, but because she had moved toward everything it had hoped for her. Her mother had written, "Go toward the life that wants you, Clara. Not the life that will take you in, but the one that genuinely wants you there." She had gone toward it without knowing it. She had stepped off a train into humiliation and had walked with her chin up and her suitcase in her hand in exactly the right direction. The woman who arrived in Red Hollow as Naughty Bride's Nobody's Bride became the woman who changed what Red Hollow believed was possible. The cowboy who stood alone in every storm he ever faced finally learned that the strongest thing a person can do is let someone stand beside them. And the stranger, the woman they laughed at on the platform, the woman Edwin Wallace sent back with 25 cents of dignity and no apology, that stranger became the heart of the valley she had come to by accident and stayed in by choice, by rescue, not by luck, by the deliberate, daily, unwavering decision to stand exactly where she had chosen to stand. It was her story. That was all of it, and it was enough.